May the Lord's peace embrace you, His light strengthen your steps, and His love never leave your heart. Welcome to God's hidden plan, where each story from the Bible is more than history, it is a living message for you today. The children of dust and starlight. Before the world was cleansed by water, it was a place of deep shadows and strange light, a world shrouded in mist and memory. In this primordial age, when the breath of Eden was still a fresh scent on the wind, giants walked the earth. They were the Nephilim, the fallen ones, towering figures whose eyes glowed with an otherworldly power, their forms a disquieting fusion of celestial grace and terrestrial might. They moved among the children of men not as equals, but as living monuments to a sacred boundary that had been catastrophically breached. Their legacy, carved into the very bedrock of the ancient world, was one of terror and awe, a story whispered on the wind and etched onto scrolls that would later crumble to dust. And then, the waters came. A world-drowning deluge, a divine erasure that washed away their works, their bodies, and their names, leaving behind only a haunting, unanswered question. Who were these mysterious giants of the Bible, and what truly happened to their descendants? Genesis speaks of them in a few enigmatic verses, a brief and terrifying prelude to the story of the flood. They were born of a forbidden union, a mingling of realms that was never meant to be. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, and from their desire came a progeny that shook the ancient world to its foundations. Yet their lineage, so powerful and dominant, seems to vanish in the churning waters of God's judgment. Were they utterly and completely erased, a failed experiment in cosmic rebellion, or did their bloodline, their very essence, somehow linger, a corrupting seed that would sprout again in the post-flood world? This is not a mere myth or a flight of fancy. It is a profound mystery that has puzzled scholars and mystics for millennia. A theological enigma that challenges our understanding of judgment, mercy, and the hidden currents of biblical history. To seek the truth is to journey back to the dawn of time, to sift through the cryptic verses of Genesis and Numbers, and to listen to the haunting echoes in ancient, non-canonical texts. The story of the Nephilim is one of celestial rebellion, terrestrial corruption, and a divine judgment so absolute it reshaped creation. It is a story that will shake you to your core, for it speaks of a world where the veil between heaven and earth was torn, and something terrible stepped through. Before the flood changed everything, these lost children of angels and men walked the earth, and their shadow still lingers. A world of creeping corruption. Let us step back to the dawn of time, into the antediluvian world as it is painted in the opening chapters of Genesis. This was an earth still young, vibrant with a life force we can scarcely imagine. The gardens were lush beyond compare. The mountains reached into skies of impossible clarity, and the rivers ran pure and strong. Humanity, descended from the initial pair in Eden, thrived and multiplied. They were a long-lived people, their lifespans stretching for centuries, giving them a perspective on time and history that is alien to us. They lived under the shadow of a broken covenant, exiled from the garden, yet still in a world where the memory of God's voice walking in the cool of the day was not so distant. Watching over this burgeoning creation were the heavenly hosts, the angels, referred to in the ancient text as the Bene Hai Elohim, the sons of God. They were beings of spirit and light, tasked with stewarding the cosmic order. But as they gazed upon the mortal plane, a profound temptation took root in the hearts of some. They looked upon the Banat Hadam, the daughters of men, and were captivated by their beauty, their vitality, their fleeting but intense existence. A line was crossed. A rebellion, born not of overt warfare, but of illicit desire, began. These angels forsook their heavenly station, descending to the earthly realm to take human wives for themselves. From this forbidden, unnatural union, a new race was born, the Nephilim. The name itself is a mystery, likely derived from the Hebrew root nephal, meaning to fall. They were the fallen ones, or perhaps those who cause others to fall. They were a hybrid race, possessing the physical power and longevity of their angelic sires and the mortal flesh of their human mothers. Genesis describes them as Gibborim, the mighty ones, the heroes of old, men of renown. But their renown was not for justice or wisdom. They were beings of immense strength and voracious appetites, their very existence a defiance of God's created order, which was built on separation and distinction, the heavens from the earth, the light from the darkness, the human from the divine. The presence of the Nephilim marked a catastrophic turning point in humanity's story. The world, once a place of relative harmony, began to descend into chaos. The Nephilim, with their superior strength and knowledge, became warlords and tyrants. They dominated the human tribes, teaching them arts of war and vanity. Their arrogance, a reflection of their father's rebellion. Imagine living in such a world where demigods walked among you, where your village could be subjugated by a single giant born of a union that challenged the very authority of heaven. The line between the sacred and the profane was not just blurred, it was violently erased. The key figures in this cosmic drama were now in place: the rebellious sons of God, the human women who bore their children, the Nephilim, their monstrously powerful offspring, and God, the sovereign creator and judge, watching as his perfect creation spiraled into a state of irredeemable corruption. The stage was set for a divine intervention of cataclysmic proportions, a judgment that would be leveled not just against humanity, but against the monstrous descendants of a forbidden love. The earth stained with violence. The arrival of the Nephilim was not a passive event. It was a catalyst that accelerated the world's descent into moral and spiritual anarchy. As their numbers grew, so did the wickedness of mankind. The 6th chapter of Genesis paints a grim and unequivocal picture. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The text directly links this state of total corruption to the era of the Nephilim. These mighty men, these heroes of old, and their human-born descendants became the leaders of a world filled with violence. Their divine-infused strength was not used to build or protect, but to dominate and destroy. They led their clans and tribes in endless cycles of warfare, oppression, and bloodshed, their pride and insatiable hunger for power infecting the whole of human society. The earth, which God had created to be a place of life and order, was now filled with Hamas, a Hebrew word that means more than just violence. It signifies a deep, pervasive corruption, a brutal lawlessness that desecrates all that is good and holy. The Nephilim, by their very nature, were a living embodiment of this corruption. They were a cosmic breach, a perversion of God's design, and their actions pushed humanity past a point of no return. Their rebellion was not just against other men, it was a direct defiance of God's established order, a declaration that power, not righteousness, was the ultimate authority on earth. Driven by their hybrid nature, the arrogance of fallen angels mixed with the fallenness of man, their actions provoked a response of profound sorrow and righteous anger from the Creator. The scripture uses startlingly anthropomorphic language to describe God's reaction. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. This was not the petulant anger of a pagan deity. It was the deep, sorrowful wrath of a loving Creator whose creation had willfully and completely defiled itself. The divine verdict was absolute and terrible. I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. The entire terrestrial creation, now stained and corrupted by this unnatural union and the violence it had spawned, was to be wiped clean. The conflict was now at its peak. The cosmic rebellion of the Nephilim and their followers versus the perfect justice of God. God had not left humanity without a witness. He had offered a path of righteousness through figures like Enoch, who walked with God and was taken up to heaven without tasting death. But the generation of the Nephilim ignored this call. Their pivotal, irreversible action, the relentless spreading of violence, corruption, and likely idolatrous practices, had sealed the world's fate. In the midst of this universal depravity, one man stood apart, Noah. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. While the Nephilim led the world into a frenzy of violence, Noah quietly and faithfully began to build an ark of gopher wood, an act of obedience in a world defined by defiance. As he hammered each plank into place, the storm clouds of judgment began to gather, not just in the sky, but in the heart of God. The moment was pivotal. The legacy of the Nephilim had triggered a divine response that would not just punish creation, but unmake it and begin anew. The rising waters of the flood would be the final, terrible answer to their cosmic rebellion. The cleansing of the world. The judgment, when it came, was absolute. The sky, once a symbol of the divine realm from which the fallen angels had descended, now became the instrument of their descendants' destruction. For 40 days and 40 nights, torrential rains fell, a deluge so relentless it seemed the heavens themselves were weeping in sorrow and fury. But the true cataclysm came from below. Genesis tells us that all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. The very foundations of the world were broken. and the primordial waters that had been separated at creation now surged upwards to reclaim the land. It was a decreation, a return to the watery chaos that existed before God had first spoken light and life into being. The aftermath was cataclysmic. This was not a local flood. It was a global cleansing. The waters rose until every high mountain was covered. Everything that had breath on dry land perished. The mighty Nephilim, who had terrorized the world with their superhuman strength, were powerless against this tide of divine justice. Their strongholds were swept away like sand castles, their armies drowned, their power revealed as nothing before the power of their creator. They, along with their human followers and their animal creations, were utterly erased from the face of the earth. Their descendants, the fruit of their cosmic rebellion, showed no repentance. They were consumed by their pride to the very end, their defiance silenced only by the churning, rising waters. Above the chaos, one object floated in serene obedience: Noah's Ark. It was a vessel of mercy in an ocean of judgment. Inside, Noah and his family, along with the pairs of animals, were preserved, a righteous seed from which a new world could grow. Genesis describes God's grief over the sin that had necessitated such a judgment, but his mercy provided a way for his covenant with humanity to continue. The legacy of the Nephilim and the world they had corrupted vanished beneath the waves, their stories drowned, leaving behind only whispers and legends to be passed down through Noah's lineage. God's judgment was complete. A new beginning was at hand, and yet, a question lingers, a faint and troubling shadow in the post-flood world. After the waters receded, and the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, God made a new promise, symbolized by a rainbow in the clouds. Never again would he destroy the earth with a flood. The divine reset was complete. But later in the biblical narrative, in the book of Numbers, the whispers of giants return. When the Israelite spies scout the land of Canaan, they return with a terrifying report of giant-like peoples, the Anakim, who they claim come from the Nephilim. This single, startling phrase challenges the finality of the flood's cleansing. Did some trace of the Nephilim's influence, or even their lineage, somehow survive? Or was their shadow so long and so terrifying that it colored the fears of a new generation? The erasure of the Nephilim was a pivotal moment in divine history, but the story of giants was, perhaps, not yet over. A lingering shadow, centuries passed. The waters of the Great Flood became a distant, foundational memory for the new world of humanity that spread out from the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The covenant was renewed, God's promise sealed by the rainbow. The world was meant to be different now, cleansed of the cosmic corruption that had necessitated its destruction. The story of the Nephilim should have been relegated to the realm of antediluvian history, a terrifying but concluded chapter. But here, in the quiet of a scholar's study, surrounded by the ancient scrolls of Genesis, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the mystery reignites. A puzzling and persistent anomaly emerges from the text that has haunted interpreters for millennia. If the flood destroyed the Nephilim and all their descendants, who were the giants that appeared after the flood? Genesis 6-4 contains a notoriously difficult phrase. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. The most common interpretation is that afterward still refers to the period before the flood, meaning that the unions continued over a long period of time. But the phrasing is ambiguous enough to leave a door open. The real puzzle, however, appears much later in the book of Numbers. When Moses sends 12 spies to scout the promised land of Canaan, they return with a report that fills the Israelites with terror. They describe a land that flows with milk and honey, but it is inhabited by powerful people. And then they deliver the chilling news: we saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. This statement is an exegetical bombshell. How could they have seen the Nephilim? The flood was a divine and total cleansing. Did some survive? Was the judgment incomplete? Or were the spies simply exaggerating out of fear, using the most terrifying name from their ancient legends to describe the large-statured people they encountered? This is the core of the anomaly. The Bible presents the flood as a definitive end to the Nephilim, yet it also records the testimony of those who claim to have seen them, or at least their descendants, centuries later. The clues don't stop there. Throughout the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua, as the Israelites conquer Canaan, they encounter several tribes described in giant-like terms. There are the Anakim, descended from Anak, whom Caleb eventually drives from Hebron. There are the Rephaim, sometimes translated as the Shades or Giants, a fearsome people whose last king, Og of Bashan, was a giant of a man whose bed was over 13 feet long. There are the Emim and the Zamzumim, other giant-like peoples who had been dispossessed by the Moabites and Ammonites. These texts consistently describe formidable, large-statured tribes that echoed the fearsome traits of the pre-flood Nephilim. The connection is never explained genetically, but the thematic link is undeniable. The presence of these towering, intimidating foes in the Promised Land raises a profound question that challenges our understanding of divine judgment and the continuity of history. What exactly happened to the lineage of the Nephilim, and did their shadow fall upon the land of Canaan? Whispers from the dust. The perplexing reappearance of giants in the post-flood world has given rise to a fascinating and often heated debate among theologians and biblical scholars. In the attempt to reconcile the finality of the flood with the spies' report in Numbers, three major theories have been proposed, each attempting to explain the whispers of a Nephilim legacy that seemed to rise from the dust of Canaan. The first and most straightforward theory holds that the Nephilim and all their direct descendants were entirely and irrevocably wiped out by the flood. According to this view, the giants encountered by the Israelites in Canaan, such as the Anakim and the Rephaim, were simply human tribes of unusually large stature. The spies' report in Numbers, which explicitly links the Anakim to the Nephilim, is interpreted not as a literal genealogical statement, but as an expression of profound fear. Faced with these intimidating warriors, the faithless spies used the most terrifying name from their ancestral stories, Nephilim, as a form of hyperbole, a way to communicate the sheer terror they felt and to justify their recommendation not to enter the land. This view is supported by historical and archaeological evidence from the ancient Near East, which contains records and depictions of warrior peoples who were noted for their size and ferocity. The giants of Canaan were formidable human enemies, not supernatural hybrids. A second view ventures into more speculative territory, arguing that the Nephilim's genetic legacy may have survived the flood, not directly, but through the lineage of Noah. This theory hinges on the wives of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The Bible is silent about their ancestry. The theory posits that one or more of these women may have carried recessive Nephilim genes, passed down from a distant ancestor who was a product of the angelic human unions. The flood would have purged the dominant Nephilim population, but the genetic potential for giantism could have re-emerged generations later, most notably in the descendants of Ham, who populated the land of Canaan. This would explain the presence of giant clans in Canaan and provide a literal basis for the spies' claim. However, this theory is highly conjectural and faces a significant theological hurdle. It suggests that God's chosen vessel for preserving humanity, Noah's family, was itself tainted by the very corruption the flood was sent to erase. A third and even more speculative theory is drawn not from the Bible itself, but from apocryphal texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. These texts suggest that the original sin of the fallen angels was not a one-time event. They propose that after the flood, there was a second incursion of rebellious angels, or that some of the original fallen angels continued their illicit activities, producing a new generation of giants in the post-flood world. This theory would neatly explain the reappearance of giants, but it finds virtually no support within the canonical scriptures. Genesis and the rest of the Bible present the flood as a singular, decisive judgment against that specific cosmic breach. The idea of a repeated offense of that magnitude is not mentioned. These extra-biblical ideas stretch far beyond the Bible's primary focus on God's judgment of pre-flood corruption and his covenant relationship with Noah and, later, Israel. The silence of the biblical text on this matter is profound, prompting us to ask whether the precise lineage of the post-flood giants matters more than the theological lesson their presence was meant to teach. The echo of rebellion. After navigating the turbulent waters of ancient legends, fearful hyperbole, and extra-biblical speculation, what is the most accepted and textually sound explanation for the Nephilim mystery? The scholarly consensus, grounded in a careful reading of the canonical texts, offers a solution that is both historically plausible and theologically profound. It asserts that the original Nephilim, the pre-flood hybrid offspring of angels and humans, were indeed a unique phenomenon whose descendants were completely and utterly destroyed in the flood, just as the narrative of Genesis implies. The later giants encountered by the Israelites, the Anakim, the Rephaim, King Og of Bashan, were not their direct genetic offspring. They were formidable, large-statured human tribes. The critical insight is that the biblical writers, particularly in Numbers and Deuteronomy, deliberately used language that echoed the pre-flood Nephilim. This connection was not genetic, but symbolic and thematic. The spies in Numbers were not making a biological claim, they were making a theological one. By invoking the name Nephilim, they were saying that the inhabitants of Canaan were as terrifying, as powerful, and as seemingly invincible as the legendary giants of old. They were framing their current challenge in the language of the ultimate ancient rebellion. This interpretation makes sense of the entire narrative arc. The Nephilim of Genesis 6 represented a catastrophic breach of the divine order, a level of corruption so profound that it required a global judgment to cleanse the earth. Their complete eradication in the flood was necessary to affirm the finality and efficacy of God's judgment. To have them reappear later would be to undermine the entire theological point of the flood narrative. The post-flood giants, therefore, served a different purpose. They were not a cosmic threat, but a test of Israel's faith. The central conflict in the book of Numbers is not between Israel and a race of demigods, but between Israel's faith and their fear. 10 of the spies see the giant Anakim and conclude, "We cannot attack those people. They are stronger than we are." Their fear, expressed in the language of the Nephilim, leads to a generation of faithless wandering in the desert. Only Joshua and Caleb have a different perspective. They see the same giants but declare, "The Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." The story of the post-flood giants is thus a story about whether Israel will succumb to the echo of rebellion and fear, or whether they will trust in God's promise to give them the land. The subsequent victories, such as the defeat of Og of Bashan and the conquest of the Anakim strongholds by Caleb, serve as powerful proof that God's people, when they walk in faith, can overcome any obstacle, no matter how intimidating it may seem. The New Testament's complete silence on the Nephilim further suggests that their role was specific to the unique context of early human history, a story of origins and a singular judgment, not a continuing biological threat. The Nephilim story teaches that God's justice will ultimately prevail over all cosmic rebellion, while the story of the Canaanite giants teaches that God's faithfulness will empower his people to overcome all earthly opposition. The mothers of the fallen. The biblical account in Genesis, with its grand, sweeping focus on cosmic events and divine judgment, often leaves the human details in the shadows. While it names the Nephilim and their angelic fathers, the sons of God, it is almost completely silent about the other key figures in this drama, the daughters of men. These unnamed women, the mothers of the fallen, are mentioned only as the objects of angelic desire. Were they willing participants in this forbidden union, seduced by the power and beauty of celestial beings? Were they tragic victims, forced into a relationship that violated the natural order? Or was it a mixture of both? Genesis doesn't say. It prioritizes the impact of the Nephilim on the world, the spread of violence and corruption, rather than the personal stories of those who brought them into being. To find these forgotten stories, one must turn to the dusty archives of apocryphal literature, most notably the ancient and influential Book of Enoch. While not part of the biblical canon, this text was widely read and respected in ancient Judaism and by the early Christian church. The Book of Enoch expands on the Genesis account in vivid and terrifying detail. It gives names to the leaders of the fallen angels, the Watchers, with their chief being Shemihaza. It describes their pact on Mount Hermon to defy God, descend to the earth, and take human wives. Enoch portrays the women not merely as passive recipients, but as partners who are taught forbidden knowledge by their angelic husbands, sorcery, incantations, the art of making weapons, and the vanity of cosmetics and adornments. In this telling, the women are central to the corruption of humanity, becoming conduits for a dangerous, illicit knowledge that helps unravel the fabric of civilization. The offspring of these unions, the giants, are depicted in Enoch as monstrous beings with insatiable appetites. They devour all the labor of men, and when that is not enough, they turn on humanity itself, consuming human flesh and blood. They are not the heroes of old mentioned in Genesis, but destructive abominations that fill the earth with sin. These non-canonical texts, while imaginative and speculative, enrich our understanding of the cosmic stakes of the rebellion. They highlight that the sin was not just a matter of illicit desire, but a deliberate transmission of forbidden secrets that armed and corrupted humanity, leading directly to the violence that grieved the heart of God. The names themselves offer clues. As noted, Nephilim likely means fallen ones, reflecting their origin from angels who fell from heaven. The name of the post-flood giants, the Anakim, is thought to derive from the Hebrew word for neck, suggesting they were long-necked or men of great stature, a purely physical description. This linguistic shift supports the idea that the Anakim were different in nature from the pre-flood Nephilim. Why the silence in Genesis on these vivid details? Because Genesis has a singular, focused purpose: to narrate the story of God's covenant with humanity. The story of the Nephilim serves as the ultimate justification for the flood. It is not intended to be a detailed mythology of angels and giants, but a theological statement about the depth of human and cosmic sin that required a divine reset. The secondary players, the women, the specific children, are left unnamed because the focus is on God's judgment and the righteousness of Noah. Nevertheless, by considering these forgotten figures as portrayed in the wider ancient traditions, we get a fuller, more tragic picture of a world where the crossing of sacred boundaries led to an explosion of chaos, and where the human cost of that rebellion was borne by everyone. The Ark and the Rainbow. As we pull back from the shadows of ancient mystery and the dust of apocryphal texts, the full picture of the Nephilim and their legacy comes into focus. It is a story of profound contrast, a divine diptych that sets the darkest rebellion against the brightest hope. The Nephilim and their descendants, born of a prideful breach of cosmic order, represent the ultimate path of defiance. Their story is a testament to the fact that God's justice will ultimately and decisively triumph over sin. They were erased by the cleansing waters of the flood, a judgment so total that it unmade the world, serving as an eternal warning that rebellion against the Creator leads only to annihilation. The forgotten figures in their story, like the daughters of men who became their mothers, highlight the tragic human cost of this cosmic sin. They remind us that rebellion is not an abstract concept. It has victims and consequences that ripple through generations. The sharp and telling contrast is found in the figure of Noah. While the Nephilim and their world chose violence, corruption, and a path that grieved the heart of God, Noah chose righteousness. He walked with God, listened to his voice, and obeyed in faith, even when it meant building a massive ark in a world that had likely never seen rain. His story mirrors the choice that faces all of humanity: to follow the path of defiant self-will or the path of faithful obedience. The Bible teaches a clear lesson through this saga. God's justice is perfect, and his holiness cannot tolerate a world saturated with a rebellion so deep that it perverts the very nature of creation. The flood was not an act of a capricious tyrant, but the necessary, sorrowful act of a righteous judge, cleansing a world that had become irredeemably corrupt. Yet, in the midst of this absolute judgment, his mercy provided a new start. The ark, floating safely above the waters of destruction, is one of the most powerful symbols of salvation in all of Scripture. God's grace preserved a righteous remnant, ensuring that his covenant with humanity would endure. The story of the Nephilim is not, in the end, about chasing giants or unraveling the precise genetics of the Anakim. It is a foundational story about God's justice and his grace. You do not need to solve every mystery of their existence to grasp the central, unshakable truth. God calls his creation to live within the beautiful and life-giving order he has established. The Nephilim's story is a stark warning to all who would dare to defy that order. It urges us to choose the path of Noah, the path of righteousness and faith, over the path of the fallen. As the floodwaters receded and Noah stepped out onto a clean earth, the first thing he saw in the clouds was a rainbow, a symbol of God's promise, a sign that even after the most terrible judgment, mercy triumphs and offers the hope of renewal. This is the enduring legacy, not the shadow of the giants, but the light of God's redeeming promise.